For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the bombs over Iran have gone quiet. No new airstrikes, no new retaliatory missiles lighting up the night sky over the Gulf. And yet, somehow, that silence is making people more nervous, not less. Because everyone from Reuters to the Associated Press to analysts inside Chatham House is asking the exact same question right now. Is this actually the beginning of the end, or just the eye of a much bigger storm? Here's what we know for certain right now, as of this week. After roughly 2 weeks of relentless nightly bombing, the United States has paused its airstrikes on Iran. Iran, in turn, has halted its own retaliatory attacks across the region. According to reporting from NPR, an official familiar with the negotiations says both Washington and Tehran actually want to return to the interim ceasefire framework they briefly agreed to back in mid-June, and that a compromise is currently being negotiated, one that would center on Iran managing vessel transit through the Strait of Hormuz with fewer restrictions than currently exist. That is a real, active, ongoing diplomatic effort, not wishful thinking. Oman continues working behind the scenes as the primary mediator between the two sides, a role it's played consistently throughout this entire war. And crucially, neither side has formally slammed the door shut on renewed negotiations. But before you breathe a sigh of relief, understand something important. This pause exists inside one of the most volatile, contradictory information environments of the entire conflict. Because at the exact same time American officials are describing active progress toward a deal, Iran's own foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, is telling a very different story entirely. Araghchi has dismissed claims of ongoing negotiations outright, stating flatly that there are no talks underway and none currently planned, describing recent contact between the two countries as nothing more than an exchange of messages. President Trump, for his part, has said publicly that Iran wants desperately to make a deal, even suggesting Tehran is simply reluctant to admit that in public. According to CNN's reporting, the actual gap between the two sides remains wide, with one regional source describing Iran's response to Washington's latest offer as, in that source's words, a maximum no to a maximalist ask. That is not the language of a negotiation on the verge of a breakthrough. That's the language of two sides who can't even agree on whether they're actually talking to each other. So which version is true? Probably, uncomfortably, both at once. This is precisely the dynamic multiple regional analysts have pointed to in trying to explain why, despite 5 months of escalating strikes, mining campaigns, and now attacks stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea to the Caspian Sea, this conflict has not yet spiraled into the kind of full, unrestrained regional war that so many feared back in February. According to detailed analysis published by outlets tracking the conflict closely, the read from experts is that both Washington and Tehran are using military pressure specifically to strengthen their own bargaining positions, not necessarily because either side is seeking outright unlimited military victory. One research organization focused on the region observed that whatever agreement eventually emerges from this war, Iran is likely to rebuild its long-term deterrence around its ability to influence the Strait of Hormuz itself, rather than through any dream of defeating the American military outright. Or that's a notably different goal than total war, and it helps explain a pattern that's been visible throughout this conflict. Intense, brutal military exchanges, followed by pauses, followed by renewed diplomatic contact, followed by more strikes when that diplomacy stalls. There's also a very specific piece of evidence analysts point to when arguing this war remains, for now, calibrated rather than open-ended, despite everything, despite the naval blockade, despite the strikes on Iranian infrastructure, despite even direct discussion of striking a facility believed to house relocated nuclear centrifuges, the United States has not launched a ground invasion of Iran. That single fact matters enormously to people studying escalation patterns, because a ground invasion has always represented the clearest, brightest line separating a punishing air and naval campaign from a full-scale war of occupation. As of this week, that line has not been crossed, even though, as we've covered before, it has been actively discussed inside the White House. That said, and this is the part that should temper any optimism, analysts are just as clear that avoiding the point of no return so far is not the same thing as being safe. Reuters has specifically warned that oil markets may be underestimating just how dangerous this moment actually is, because traders seem to be operating on the assumption that neither Washington nor Tehran genuinely wants a wider war. That assumption might be correct. But Reuters' own reporting flags brinkmanship and simple miscalculation as serious, persistent risks, especially now that the original June ceasefire framework has already collapsed once already. The Associated Press has made a similar point even more bluntly, warning that every new exchange between these two countries increases the chance that events spiral beyond what either government actually intends. A strike that causes heavy civilian casualties. A direct clash between American and Iranian naval vessels in the crowded, narrow waters of the Strait. An attack that lands on major Gulf energy infrastructure rather than a purely military target. Any single one of those scenarios on its own could transform what has so far been a contained, if brutal, confrontation into something region-wide and far harder to stop. And the reality on the ground right now gives plenty of reasons for that caution. Even with the pause in direct US-Iran strikes, the broader region has not actually calmed down. Yemen's Houthi rebels, aligned with Iran, said just this weekend that they fired missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia, a retaliation for Saudi airstrikes on the strategic Red Sea city of Hodeidah. The Houthis claim they've effectively closed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a waterway that has become even more critical for Saudi oil exports, specifically because the Strait of Hormuz remains so disrupted. And meanwhile, the U.S. military says it's still actively enforcing its naval blockade of Iranian ports, confirming it disabled a Mozambique-flagged vessel in the Gulf of Oman just last week after that ship attempted to breach the blockade and ignored repeated warnings. And Trump himself, even while publicly spotlighting diplomacy, has kept up direct threats against Iran in the same breath, a pattern that's been consistent throughout this entire war. Talk softly about deals while continuing to apply hard military pressure. Layer on top of that the new front we've already seen open up in the Caspian Sea, where Ukraine struck an Iranian-linked vessel, killing one sailor, an incident Iran has called an act that cannot go unanswered. And you start to see exactly why analysts are so hesitant to declare this pause a genuine turning point. Al Jazeera's reporting from inside Tehran this week captured the scope of what Iran is actually juggling right now. A near-total closure of the Strait of Hormuz, disruption in the Red Sea from the Houthis, and now an active flashpoint with Ukraine in the Caspian, all happening simultaneously, even as mediated talks with Washington supposedly continue in the background. Iran's own Ministry of Petroleum revealed this week that the country has sold $11.5 billion worth of crude oil since the war began, including $6.5 billion during the brief window the June ceasefire framework held, numbers that show Iran is still finding ways to keep its economy functioning under blockade, but also numbers that hint at just how much financial pressure this war is placing on Tehran, especially with reports that Iran's government may now be forced to consider raising domestic fuel prices, a move that carries serious risk of stoking public unrest at home, even as the country fights a war abroad. And there's a military buildup happening in parallel with all of this diplomatic maneuvering that cannot be ignored either. According to Gulf News, the United States has continued moving additional forces into the region even as talks are floated, including Marines aboard the USS Tripoli and paratroopers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division. Officials have been careful to stress that this kind of deployment does not automatically guarantee ground action will follow, but they've also confirmed that options currently under discussion include striking or even seizing key pieces of Iranian infrastructure. That's an uncomfortable contradiction sitting right at the heart of this entire moment. Paratroopers moving into the theater at the exact same time diplomats are supposedly closing in on a deal. So, does the analyst take that this headline points to actually hold up under scrutiny? In the narrowest sense, yes. Neither Washington nor Tehran, based on everything currently visible, appears to want the kind of unrestrained, no-limits war that would mean a full ground invasion of Iran, or strikes explicitly designed to collapse the Iranian government entirely. The pattern of calibrated escalation, hit hard, pause, negotiate, hit hard again when talks stall, has held for 5 months now, and both sides still appear to be operating within that same basic logic even this week. But calibrated is not the same as safe, and contained is not the same as over. The Houthis are firing on Saudi Arabia. Ukraine and Iran are trading threats over the Caspian. American paratroopers are moving into the region. At the same moment, American diplomats claim they're closing in on a deal Iran's own foreign minister says doesn't exist. Any one of those threads, pulled too hard, in the wrong direction, at the wrong moment, could be the miscalculation multiple serious analysts have already warned about publicly. For now, the guns over Iran itself have gone quiet, and that quiet is genuinely meaningful. A real, if fragile, opening for the kind of negotiated off-ramp this region has been searching for since February. I insist, but every expert actually studying this conflict closely is delivering the same message in slightly different words. This is closer to de-escalation than this war has been since the fighting resumed, but it is not there yet. Watch Oman's mediation efforts. Watch whether Iran's own government ever confirms the negotiations Washington keeps insisting are happening. And watch the Red Sea and the Caspian just as closely as you watch the Strait of Hormuz, because in a war with this many moving fronts, the next miscalculation, the one that turns a calibrated conflict into an uncontained one, could come from almost anywhere.